Alex, good afternoon. How are you?
It's great. Thanks, Leslie. How are you doing?
I am wonderful. It's morning for me. I'm here in Arizona, soaking up the sun for a few more days before I head back to snowy Chicago. Excellent. Okay, it looks like we have some folks joining. 9 o'clock on the dot, 9 o'clock Arizona time at least. Let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are joining from. My name is Leslie Venetz. I'm the Director of New Member Expansion for Procurement Leaders. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Alex Johnston, the Principal Analyst and co-writer of the Digital Procurement Landscape report. And you guessed it, we are here to give you a sneak preview of the Digital Procurement Landscape report. Alex will answer a few questions and share why this report is essential for all procurement professionals. If you want early access to the report, follow the link that we'll drop in this live, and also join us next Friday for part 2 in this series. So Alex, you are my go-to resource on everything procurement technology related. I have a few questions for you that I think our audience would also love you to answer. Are you ready for the sneak preview?
Yeah, certainly. Also honored to be your single contact for procurement technology things, Leslie.
Wonderful. So first question, why should procurement care? Why is it critical that procurement understands the technology landscape?
It's really interesting, actually. So a couple of years ago, you would have seen like a lot of research about why procurement should be excited about technology or what the benefits of technology are. But actually, I think we sort of moved beyond that. You know, the vast majority of procurement functions are more than aware of the benefits of technology. Often the challenge for them is one of either making that case internally or more commonly getting an understanding of how to realize those benefits. And one of the aspects of that is the technology landscape, where you'll often find that digital project leads in procurement functions will tend to have quite a narrow scope of solution providers they're aware of. It will normally be, the largest suite providers in the S2P space, for example. And there's a lot of enthusiasm about like working with smaller providers, perhaps, or specialist providers in new emerging areas, or startups gets mentioned a lot. But actually, if you look at awareness about the sort of solutions available in this market, procurement tends to limit itself to a very small spectrum of potential providers. So that's kind of what we're trying to look at in this report. Can we sort of diversify those awareness, I suppose, of those solution providers?
I love that. Yes, an awareness of the diversity of suppliers out there outside of just the big brands. And something you mentioned, Alex, was opening up the ability to work with small companies, maybe diverse companies, startups. And I know that's something that is an ongoing conversation in the procurement community. So it seems like there's some alignment there. So to your point, I mean, there are a ton of tools out there to be considered. There are a ton of factors to be considered. What should procurement executives really be looking at when they are exploring new tools?
So there's obviously a few aspects we go into it on in terms of the areas that are being looked at. So the sort of elevation of importance in like ease of use, for example, that's really been elevated. And that's partly just a reflection on the fact that procurement functions have found when they bring these solutions live, actually, often they're not seeing desired levels of ROI because procurement practitioners aren't comfortable making use of the platforms. And part of that's change management, part of that's that renewed focus on ease of use to try and improve that experience. What might be a slightly more controversial, perhaps, but interesting hypothesis from the report on terms of selection criteria is around that single suite best of breed dichotomy. So historically, our research has found that procurement functions will tend to focus on or aspire towards that single suite approach. They'll work with one large procurement technology provider. Actually, this report is seeing more of a transition towards a broader spectrum of smaller providers, smaller, more focused providers. And there's a few reasons for that as part of selection criteria. But one aspect of that, which is really interesting, is around what procurement's trying to achieve with its technology. So effectively, procurement's identified a more diverse and strategic value proposition. And part of that's through automating core procurement capabilities. They're looking at areas like improving procurement's contribution to CSR or risk management or even product or service enhancement. And when you see what that means in terms of technology, it means that procurement's actually looking at technologies outside of sort of core procurement areas, even procurement tech providers, and they're looking for vastly more advanced capabilities in some functionality areas like risk management, for example. So contract mining really came to the fore as well as being an area of interest for procurement functions.
Interesting. So you're seeing a bit of a transition away from the sort of go-to single suite usage that we've had in the past, to procurement functions that are looking for maybe more niche technologies that are better aligned to exactly what they need to accomplish?
Yeah, that's part of it. There's another aspect to it, which is quite interesting, though, is maybe it's a change in what people mean by single suite or best of breed. So because procurement's now got a sort of a wider purview, I suppose, and what it's considering under its system strategy is far more diverse, it no longer makes sense just to say, I'm going to work with this one solution provider to offer all those capabilities. Because in some cases, it's not even a logical extension of the platforms already being looked at. As you said, we're looking at a niche and emerging areas which perhaps aren't so well supported by the procurement technology landscape. So perhaps part of that transition is just a recognition that by system strategy, we mean this wider value proposition. We mean looking at areas like risk in more depth, contributing to CSR, those sorts of things.
Oh, that's really interesting. And, we obviously, and I'm thinking most of our amazing viewers who are in the chat here, letting us know where they're joining from. But, in our ecosystem, we constantly talk about procurement as a strategic advisor to business partners and procurement's ability to collaborate cross-functionally. And it sounds like a lot of that is coming into a more holistic view of procurement technology as well.
Yeah, and particularly things about sort of data landscape. So procurement's looking at how it can aggregate a wide array of diverse data sets beyond just core purchasing data, which obviously used to be the focus. When procurement used to talk about analytics, it meant spend analytics. It's quite clear now that procurement's looking far more, as you said, in a far more strategic lens as to how it can be a strategic advice to the business or contribute to broader discussions, leveraging perhaps its market intelligence and those sorts of capabilities. So as part of that, procurement's as procurement undertakes a transformation, it's having to look at digital transformation as a way of enabling that. And therefore, in the last couple of years, we've seen a huge change in the way that procurement teams are approaching technology, which is really interesting. Far more aligned with strategic initiatives of the business rather than small procurement benefits.
Yeah, it sounds like far more aligned to the kind of vision for procurement as that total value partner. So that's really great to hear that your research uncovered that same kind of journey for the function. For everybody that has joined us, that's in the chat, sharing where you're from, thank you. Also, if you have any questions for Alex, don't hesitate to drop those in the chat. I guess one question I had for you, because I had a look at the report, it's great. I'm excited for our live next week so we can dig even deeper into it. But at first glance, I was wondering, there is a focus on some pretty specific technologies. And I'm wondering why you decided to go that route, why those technologies are the focus of this report.
So what's quite interesting, I think, is when you look at market intelligence in the space, it's very, very limited. So you'll find that there are a lot of reports on technology and procurement technology, but they're often either very sort of pie in the sky strategic, or they're limited to just, we mentioned before, there's large S2P suites really. So it might compare these large S2P suites in like an ideal environment. But what we want to look into is actually how technology supported procurement processes and procurement activities. So because we're taking this from a procurement perspective, not a technology perspective, we want to see how many technologies interrelate, for example, around things like work assignment, for example, or risk management. There might be a few aspects to that. You might be looking at supply chain risk and things like social media raising potential warning flags, I suppose, as to what's going on. Or that could be something like we mentioned contract mining already, or that could be something like having verification of supplier data, for example. There's a wide array of different ways procurement activities can be supported by technologies. So really, we wanted that procurement cut rather than technology to give people a more holistic vision as to what would go into a digital roadmap if we wanted to realize, business value.
So we had an interesting question come in, Alex, that I think speaks to that. From Henel, the question is, with such a diverse tech ecosystem, how do we ensure we can be data-driven?
It's a really, really good question. So there's a few aspects of this. So part of it's technical, and partly this is driving that move to best of breed. So actually, a lot of the smaller providers we've been talking to over the years have changed the sort of approaches towards integration. And part of that's like technology related, growth of things like open API layers and that sort of thing. But part of it's cultural as well. So vendors talking about how they can have intra-vendor partnerships, for example, or even heard about swarm sales. So solution providers, multi-solution providers targeting one business problem for a customer, for example. So that's part of it. Partly it's improvements on the integration side, but there's also basically far more focused on the procurement side about things like data stewardship, having a holistic data strategy, and actually by tying that all together and having some sort of underlying architecture, so perhaps a data warehouse or data lakes, procurement's now in a far stronger position to pull data from all these disparate data sources and make use out of it. Obviously, this is still a story of development. Very, very few of our members have cracked it, but we have got we're in a significantly stronger position now than we were 2 or 3 years ago when we were looking at this area. We've got plenty of case studies about companies who've gone from having very little in place to having a full sort of data management strategy, which is solving for a lot of these problems.
That's great. That's great. And thank you for that question. So speaking of cracking the code, I've seen this come up a few times in the comments, and if we have to wait for part 2 next week, tell me. I can be patient for a week, but anything in the report that plays into sort of the next gen procurement technologies, looking at AI or looking at blockchain, anything along those lines?
Yeah, we have been looking at some of those technologies. It's interesting, actually. So a couple of years ago, I remember being on stage and sort of denigrating a lot of these emerging technologies. I was saying, actually, we haven't seen them applied to procurement use cases. Blockchain, still people using it conceptually, but we haven't really seen it applied. That's now changing. We are seeing more use cases of people applying blockchain to, I mentioned supplier information verification earlier. We do see IBM have just come out with a product on that, for example. So we are seeing blockchain becoming more integrated with procurement use cases. Machine learning, we've seen it a lot in the sort of, so I mentioned data management being a big focus. We've seen it a lot in data cleansing and data aggregation, for example. We're now seeing it applied more to things like prescriptive analytics, for example, to AI being used to suggest potential outcomes. And we're still at the start of that journey, but we're now seeing a lot of these innovations, I think, filter through, not just through startups, but actually the largest providers are also all exploring these technologies as well, which is something worth considering.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about blockchain, and forgive me for going down a bit of a rabbit hole, but it's just so fascinating. We had another question come in about procurement's ability to use technology to reduce fraud risk. I know a piece of that can be blockchain. Anything else that you uncovered in this digital procurement landscape report?
The blockchain case study is really interesting. So I mentioned that the supplier information verification piece around supplier banking details and blockchain. But again, another blockchain application of that, Jay actually has written that in the comments, is around smart contracts and how that could potentially be applied to reducing risk. But perhaps a little bit less relevant to risk necessarily, although it does have an aspect there as well. We've seen a lot of focus on contracts. We've also seen a couple of case studies of organizations who've gone into sort of quite extensive data science activities to try and uncover potential fraud within purchasing organizations. So that's another aspect of that as well. But there's a few ways that individuals are trying to deal with it. It is obviously purchasing fraud is still a major problem within organizations.
Excellent. And don't forget to reserve your copy of the Digital Procurement Landscape report. The link is in this live so that you can read a bit more about that. One question that just came in, we're kind of taking a turn, going a different direction. But this question from Simon, we'll post it in a moment here. What insight would you offer around the importance of a digital culture in the adoption of technology, and how does the role and competency of procurement need to change? I know this is a passion project for everybody at Procurement Leaders. What's your take, Alex?
Yeah, no, it's just a brilliant question. And the reason for that is, so you might have people who've follow our research closely, might have seen our digital readiness assessment, for example. So our digital readiness assessment, we effectively went away and we interviewed, I think it was around senior practitioners, around 100 organizations to get a vision for what was in their roadmap for improvement, based on previous projects, what had been sort of bottlenecks or things stopping them from realizing digital value. And what we found out was people went into it thinking it would all be largely around technical problems, things like data accessibility, integration, a lot of what I've mentioned already. What we found is the organizations who performed most badly tended to have their biggest deficits in culture. So either that was because they didn't have, people weren't enthusiastic about onboarding technologies. There wasn't really like a suitable change management piece in place. So there wasn't individuals who were skilled in that area, and they weren't really willing to build a narrative of why procurement should be advancing. But we often see the biggest culture issues being at a sort of leadership level. So partly it was a lack of drive a couple of years ago from senior executives to get involved in these projects. And part of the way of addressing that is obviously cultural.
That's great. And Simon, thank you for that question. I promise we didn't, Simon's not a plant, but that is just a question that's so aligned to the work that we're doing and the work that our membership is doing. So Simon, thank you for the question. Alex, thank you for the answer. I'm seeing so many amazing questions come in. We're not going to have time to get to all of them today, so please do join us next Friday for our second in this series on the digital procurement landscape. But Alex, before we leave today, one of the things that struck me as I was reviewing the report, there's no shortage of research organizations producing research on procurement technology topics. I think we can all agree on that. But this report, it felt a bit different, it read a bit different. And so I'm curious if you got that same takeaway, and if so, what do you think makes this report different, or what do you think it makes reading amongst all the the options out there?
Yeah, so one of the things I think is really great about Procurement Leaders research as a whole, really, but particularly this report, and I can say that because I wrote it, is the member-led aspect to it. So what's really nice is rather than having just a disparate analyst view, so I didn't go away and sort of like paint out what I thought the procurement technology landscape looked like you see in sort of other major technology research providers. What we had instead was a lot of our basically our membership will identify the solutions they're using, their experience with those solutions. How easy was it to deploy? What was the ease of use? And because we've given it to them, you get a far more sort of democratic and I think accurate vision of what's actually going on. And you also, I think the problem with often technology research, and I think I touched upon this briefly before, but you'll often have analysts comparing two solutions in an ideal environment. So we're saying like, oh, this solution, works like this, it's got this functionality. But actually, it's far more interesting to see what that looks like was actually applied in a concrete way to a procurement function. What is the experience like for them? Are they getting effective use out of all this wide array of functionalities? So the member-led nature of it, I think, makes our research really interesting. It's not just an analyst perspective. It's an aggregation of the views of a wide array of different companies over lots of different industries, which is really interesting.
That makes a lot of sense, because the member voice, the sort of practitioner voice, is something that really jumped out at me as I was reviewing it. And I think one of the other things that resonated with me, and certainly I'm not as close to the procurement technology spaces as you are, was just how many procurement technology companies were part of the discussion that were names I'd never heard of before. And I mean, I do procurement all day long, every day, and there were so many new companies.
Yeah, it's really intriguing. It's quite a dynamic space, actually, albeit one with a lot of quite aggressive merger and acquisition activities. It's constantly changing. It's quite a hard landscape to keep track of.
Well, we're going to talk more about it next week. So I look forward to that. Thank you, everybody who joined us. Please come back Friday for part 2 in this LinkedIn Live series. And do not forget to get that early access to the report. Follow the link that's in this live. Alex, thank you so much for your time today. And thank you for your insights and answers.
Thank you very much, Leslie. I look forward to speaking to everyone next week. Thanks very much.